GFCF podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode on Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Beginkos Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the Wits Business School here in Johannesburg. I'm glad to be joined by Jenny Hodgson, the Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Jenny, welcome to the
Thank
episode.
you very much, Becky.
Let's start in 1992. You write somewhere that you left your native land, the UK, went to Uganda, and you have never gone back. Let's talk about that with your dogs and everything.
Okay, have to remember back that far.
Yeah.
So it's true. So I had just graduated from university in the UK, and the previous year during my holidays I had travelled a little bit in East Africa, and I'd gone to Uganda, and I'd gone down to the southwest of Uganda, down to Kabale, and I went back to university and heard that there was a teaching position in that same town, and thought, oh wow, how amazing, that would be fascinating to go and live there for a year. So I did that thing of somebody finishing university and deciding they would go and find themselves on the other side of the world, and I spent a year living in a village about an hour away from the Rwandan border.
Yeah. So sticking with Uganda, I remember, I think the first time I actually met you was in Uganda at the Ginger River, where we were looking at some of the philanthropic consultations around setting up of what eventually became Trust Africa, but then it was called the Special Initiative for Africa. And at that point, you and I think Andrew were doing some work around philanthropy. Can we probably go back there and try to pull out some of the key issues that you were looking at and how those issues have shaped the journey and even the philanthropic landscape today?
Yeah, well, it really was a landmark meeting in that, well, that meeting was around 2001, 2?
Probably
2004. Okay, so I was based in Kenya there then, and had been doing some work also with the Ford Foundation on their African Philanthropy Initiative, and then was doing it under the auspices of Alavida as well at the time. And if you remember at that meeting, it really was the convergence of a number of initiatives, particularly that Ford had invested in West Africa, East Africa and Southern Africa, to start to come together and say, under the umbrella of the larger thing that became Trust Africa, to say, what is African philanthropy? What are we talking about? And what are we trying? I think if I look back then, it really was the moment where the research track and the kind of practice track really seemed to come together in a Pan-African meeting for the first time. So I look back on it, and it does feel like it was a particular landmark.
Yeah. So there's a picture that I took while there, and I recently posted it on some of my social media platforms. And I was looking back there, looking at the people who were in that meeting, and just trying to map out where they are. And some of them, Hannah, for example, who is with the Ford Foundation, is now doing a PhD with us. And there were lots of other people there. But I started there because one of the products of that meeting was the book that I then edited with Tade, which you had a big hand in, and I think that publication has gone on to almost become one of the biggest outcomes of that process. And we are using it now in different contexts in universities for teaching and all of that. But I know in the early beginnings, you were the person that was managing that book project.
It's true. It was quite a long and complicated process.
Yeah.
But it was, again, it felt like a really important piece at the time. I think in the early days, it did feel like we were kind of pushing a big rock up a hill. But when it kind of came together, and particularly with the title of it, which way around is it? Giving to help, helping to give.
Yeah, something like
that. It kind of balanced that sort of notion of philanthropy as being something that's sort of bottom-up and innate, but also something that could be facilitated further by external actors. And I think that has really been the journey that a lot of the African philanthropy discourse has taken since then.
And then we move and fast forward to 2006, where you became the founding director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. How did that come about? And then we'll talk about the Global Fund after that.
Sure. So I had left Kenya in 2004 with my husband had got a job in Southeast Asia, so we were in Singapore and then in Thailand. But I was still doing some work, particularly associated with the Ford Foundation's global philanthropy portfolio. And this position came up, and in fact, the Global Fund for Community Foundations is one of those rare instances where the right kind of money came along at the right kind of time. So the World Bank had, I think it was actually the efforts of the Ford Foundation and the Mott Foundation to bring the World Bank into conversations around philanthropy. So where the World Bank was talking about community-driven development and private foundations were talking about philanthropy, this idea of actually starting to see if the World Bank could look at local philanthropic institutions as repositories for community-driven development processes eventually. So somebody who had was the gentleman who set up the first community foundation in Slovakia, had a role in the bank for a couple of years. I think it was very difficult to make any of these ideas land in the bank just because of what it is. It's so big, so top-down. You just about got somebody interested and then they left or moved to a different country or part of the organization. But what he did manage to do was to identify the development grant facility there. So when I joined the fund, I always sort of say we started with money but no idea, and then we had ideas and no money. So in the early days, there was an investment of $1.5 million from the World Bank, which was matched by private philanthropy, really to test the premise of a global institution that could respond to this idea of emergence of community philanthropy and community foundations as things that were bubbling up around the world. And that's when I just thought, wow, what a wonderful opportunity. And that's when I got involved.
Yeah. So before, I would want us to talk about the journey, but talking about the World Bank, it takes me back to one of the meetings that we held in Tanzania, where the World Bank was very much involved in the establishment of several community foundations, Kinindoni, Morogoro, among others. What has been the outcome of that process?
It's a great question, and it's a very relevant question right now, particularly as bilateral and multilateral funders are under increasing pressure to localize aid. This was it was an early effort to localize aid. The trouble is that it's very hard for an institution like the World Bank to start initiatives that involve people putting their own money on the table when they are the World Bank. Yeah. I think all of the issues to do with, how does a big external funder create the conditions in which real, genuine, authentic initiatives can take seed? Because if the World Bank comes along and suggests a community foundation is a good idea, one is likely to agree if there are resources on the table. And I think, with the benefit of hindsight, I do think we've learned a lot about how important it is for large institutions to understand this sort of hidden piece of the civil society infrastructure, these bridging institutions, these interstitial actors that have such an important role to play. But actually, the processes by which they go about establishing these things need to be done in a very gentle, hands-off, and long-term kind of way. So it was that thing of sort of too much interest, too short a term, too high expectations, and perhaps, I'm always interested to hear about oaks, as in oak trees, as in, against men in Africa, in South Africa, that grow very, very fast. But a few weeks ago, one in our neighbourhood just fell over, and apparently it's because this is from a northern clime, and here they grow too quickly and their roots don't go deep enough. And so I do think that there is learning from all of these initiatives, they weren't bad ideas, but how they were delivered needs to be done differently, and I think that was a big takeaway from that.
But to be fair to the process, we actually have, I know that Morogoro
they're still
Community
there.
Foundation is still in existence, and so there's a lot of lessons to even draw from them
Absolutely,
as well.
and I just think they probably didn't start in the best circumstances. It's one of those things where they're still here, but maybe they wouldn't have wanted to start from there. So no, I mean, it's testimony to their durability that they've lasted, but they perhaps could have taken, I think they've taken a longer journey than they might have done with other kinds of investments and support at the time.
So back to the Global Fund for Community Foundations, the idea of a community foundation, or the very concept, stretches its history back to, I think, 1914, from a guy, I think his name is Geoff. What was the rationale to saying this is time to have an institution that looks at community foundations from a global perspective?
So it's called the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and but I think from the beginning I didn't want that narrative about Frederick Goff to be the only narrative, because if you start looking at the essence of community foundations, of people coming together, building trust, organising collective action, mobilising their resources in a less sort of US-centric kind of way. Yeah. These kinds of systems and structures have existed all over the world for a long time. They just didn't have a name. Yeah. So I suppose we've never really got round to thinking about changing our name, and we're a tiny organisation, so it's sort of been the last on my to-do list. And actually, I would say that I've always felt, language is a very tricky issue. A community foundation actually, it connotes something very powerful, the idea of community and a long-term institution. And so I still hold dear that concept, but a bit like philanthropy connotes love of mankind, but it denotes Bill Gates. And community foundation still tends to denote the place where it has the most of the US North American models. So I think we've really tried to move between community foundation, I mean, we use a lot of commas, community foundations, grassroots grant makers, women's funds, all of those things that relate to this idea, and to embed that in the larger field of community philanthropy as practice, as perhaps more organic, less structured, and to sort of actually think about how you move between, what's the interplay between institution and practice, and just cultures of being and giving. So I think it's just one of those things where the language works in one way, but often it kind of sends people off in another direction. And I always, one of the stories is indeed about Frederick Goff. He did have a good idea about making US philanthropy at that time more efficient, and well done him. It was a visionary idea. But I believe in multiple narratives, the beyond the single story thing. And I sometimes feel a bit troubled when I go somewhere and someone says the first community foundation was this, and you're kind of going, but actually you've had this thing in front of you for all this time. Let's not forget that.
Yeah, it's just that we didn't have a name for it, or we didn't give it that name. Yeah. So how big is this sector of the community-like community foundations?
Yeah.
How big is it?
For as long as I've been doing this job, people go, how many are there? And I'm like, does it really matter? So there have been, I understand data collection and numbers really matter. But I've also found at times when we've tried to count things, we've counted things that I don't think really were, and we've missed things that I think really weren't. So this is me avoiding answering your question, Becky, you realise that. So what I would say is since 2006, we have made grants and built relationships with around 230 organisations in 75 countries around the world. And I would say some of those things call themselves community foundations. We have definitely not supported everything that calls itself a community foundation in the Global South and Central Eastern Europe. Our approach has been to sort of try and find those institutions for whom these ideas resonate. And I think in that sense we can produce data on that, but because we have a purpose rather than just a need to count things, I think that's for others to do in other parts of the ecosystem, and I welcome that. But ours has really been to more one of an accompaniment of journeying. And I think, if I think off the top of my head, I would say probably a good 40% of the organisations we have made grants to, maybe more, would call themselves as a community foundation. Others don't call themselves anything related to fund or foundation. Others call themselves women's funds, development foundations. And I think, my first degree was in English literature, and I've always found linguistics very interesting. So I think in our work we've tried to be driven by essence rather than labels. And I think we do need the interplay between the time, because labels give clarity. They create tribes and clusters and things. But in our space, I think, there are others who focus in more on specifics in the same way that people focus on early childhood development or education or whatever, those who work with community foundations or socio-environmental funds. But for me, the fund really has been about a place of kind of trying to mix it up and break down barriers and silos. And I think that's been one of the most exciting things of this journey, is because suddenly you have a much richer and more diverse field.
And the narrative certainly changes when you look at it from that perspective. And so I'm keen to know, if you look at the different regions that you are present, what would be some of the key, I would say, maybe not stories, but maybe narratives that one could, kind of hold on to and say, maybe, Africa is diverse, but there could be certain elements that we could immediately say, when we're looking at this field, these are some of the trends, or these are some of the emerging issues. When you look at Asia, Eastern Europe, you're in all these regions. Are there specific or even changing narratives that we should be aware of?
Yeah, and of course one is always in danger of generalizing, the first being global north, global south, and then taking a continent or whatever. But I would say, there are definitely contextual dynamics matter a lot, but I think there are larger narratives. There are probably more coherent and cohesive narratives across more of Africa than there might be across other parts, say, of Asia. Asia quickly gets very, very different. In Central and Eastern Europe, this really was a story about what happens when the state is no longer the only actor, and that narrative. You've got a private sector, a government who has less resources, democratic systems and structures. What's the role of the third sector? And when you don't have much international development aid, well, you have to look within for resources. I think in the African context, and trying not to be over-generalizing, I do think there's some threads. I think there are some powerful threads around giving mutuality, recognition of the other, collective action, a sense of communality, I think, is very strong. Not everywhere, not in all places. And I think just coming from Malawi, people already seeing that starts to be eroded as the the nuclear family plays a larger role. And yet there's something, I think, very powerful about that memory of that sort of historically, and the fact that so many people belong to some kind of philanthropic giving thing, even if they don't call it that. So I think there's that thread around there being something innate there. I think that, and that relates to, the Cyclone Freddy. Those were all local, the first responders were all local. So people had their first meal, spent their first night after the flood in somebody else's house. And I think that, we can talk about that, but that is almost entirely invisible to the system. The fact the ones that do the heavy lifting right at the start are written out of the story. I do think there's a narrative around, where you have a growing middle class and you have people living in more nuclear structures, and, so middle class with disposable income. Perhaps if you're successful in your family, you carry the burden of giving. You're maybe the only one. And so the appeal for structured ways of giving, so contributing to other ways of doing things that don't entirely rely on you, I think that's an idea that really could be developed further. So it's not just, me supporting my family and you supporting yours, but what if we were to contribute to something that could address some of the underlying causes, right? I think the emergence of high net worth philanthropy is obviously a big piece of this puzzle, and by now we're getting very far away from the kind of grassroots side of things. And I do think in terms of the international development aid and philanthropy system, this understanding that how money has come into Africa over a very long time just simply hasn't worked. You know, it has been focused on buying projects, not actually helping to create systems and structures that could exist beyond. So I do think this is a really interesting and important moment where, if you look back to Ginger or the early work, the early research you did for your PhD, which sort of still felt quite at the edge, like who wants to know this, right? And now I think those early investments where you can actually look back, 20 years and start saying we have been following this for some time is really important. I feel like we're starting to line up the pieces for some really ambitious and forward-looking ways of thinking about how we turn this whole narrative about who has resources and who doesn't on its head.
I was saying, Jenny, I'm diverting a bit. I was taken back to 2008. We had just come from a consultative meeting, which you organized with Trust Africa in Naivasha. And on our way back to Nairobi, you were telling us about your son. We had started some philanthropic activities. I think, to start thinking about giving back. I think it was to a school or something.
It was to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. Yes.
Yes. So can you talk a bit about that? Because I was always fascinated. He was very young in that
He's
stage.
very young.
And right now I think he's in his 20s.
Yeah.
Or so, right?
He is. So, when you're working and you've got kids, your kids are never very interested in what you do. But over the years, they sort of wondering why I was traveling to places and what it was I was doing and should one, and I think when we moved to South Africa from Thailand, I think they were quite, shocked by seeing, people begging on street corners and just, the levels of inequality that you experience in Johannesburg. In 1 minute, you're sitting in this, several million rand house, and the next minute, you're driving past people who are, begging on the street for food. And so we lived very close to the fund, and he had met Bongi Makabela, the CEO, a couple of times, and he had really, I think, seeing a place, we would drive past it on the way to school, the fund, and he would say, well, where do they get their money from and how does it work? And Bongi had just started to the efforts to build the children's hospital at the time. And so he just announced to me one day that he would give, he basically invented tithing for himself, but from his pocket money he would contribute a certain amount. And then when his piggy bank was full, he would go and give it to Bongi. He was very serious about the whole thing. So indeed, he filled his piggy bank, and then sometimes people would come to the house and he'd very seriously get his piggy bank out and say, I'm collecting for the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, please give me some money. And who's going to say no to a small boy? Like that. So we went along to give it to the fund, and I think that sort of sparked an idea which became called the By Kids for Kids campaign that was used for the hospital. And I think it does go back to really some of the principles of this work, that no one is too poor to give and no one is too rich to receive, that actually there's something about giving as a way to create this empathy between people. Like, I don't know if I can do anything immediately right now, but by giving, I am seeing you. So, obviously, as his mother, I was very, very proud, but I was also kind of quite impressed, thinking, gosh, I wasn't thinking about this stuff when I was your age.
Yeah, it goes to show us the extent to which at times we do have an impact on kids without really noticing at that point in time. I digress, but I wanted to bring it in because we were talking about how, it's the communities at times that respond. And when measured in terms of, sizes and amounts, that could be seen as, this is just a small intervention, but in significance of importance, it's actually very, very valuable. And so I was drawn back to that story because we're all taken aback and surprised this young man is doing this for the Children's Fund, for that matter. So back to the narratives that we were talking about across the world. And of course, as the fund, you have had to respond to some of those contexts. What are your key projects that you would say in each of these regions or universally you are implementing today, and to what extent have they been successful? And if there have been any challenges, let's talk about those as well.
The big challenge is community philanthropy as practice and as theory is still not valued. It's not recognised. A lot of the literature is still grey. This is really important, the work that you're doing here at CAPC. So it's somehow seen as second class. In the early years, I always sort of feel like one of the ways that we've managed to turn this work, not just to be more than a grant-making fund, but really a network and the sort of, even at times a sense of a movement, is because we didn't really have very much money from the start. $1 million doesn't go very far if you're funding globally. So I think we've learned a lot about the importance of resources that can meet people where they are to do the things they want to do. So we don't fund projects. Our grant making is quite simple, really. It's like we look for and we invite applications from people who really want to try to do something in their community and think differently, experiment, test new ideas, turn the organisation around, that kind of a thing. But there's very little resource for it. At best you find those that are able to channel money tend to be more developed grant-making foundations, and even then they are only partially seen, I would say, by international funders. They get seen as intermediary grant makers. Oh, I can give my money to you to direct for me. And there's always much less interest in the local resourcing piece. And yet, I think, if at times I've ever had doubts around, is this worthwhile? Is the amount of money being raised locally worth it? It is the experience of our partners who say, every shilling, kwacha, ruble, rupee we raise is transformational for us. It is what we are about. And I think that's wherever it is in the world. So, in Ukraine right now, over the last year, Ukrainian community foundations have continued to raise small contributions from the community in a time of war. This is more than money, clearly. So I think starting to try and, to be able to aggregate stories of that narrative, that actually it doesn't really matter about the size of the money, it's the behaviour. It's the behaviour and what that leads to, that sense of moving from the individual to the collective. I think, so starting to kind of raise those narratives has been a really, really important piece of our work. We've seen, up until COVID, we had seen a number of our partners having to respond to disasters, and that, again, seeing with our own eyes, whether it was the earthquake in Nepal or floods in Brazil, that, again, these are first responder organizations. They were raising money, getting money out of the door because they knew the community early on. And again, this picture in the context of the humanitarian aid system is entirely missing still. I think COVID was really the proof of concept. Actually, who did communities go to in the first instance but the local funds and foundations who were there in their communities? And so it was both a demonstration of the importance of trusted organizations who were there, the ability for them to kind of move and mobilize and harness resources and disperse them appropriately, contextually over time, I think is a really, really important part of that story. And then, with the Ukraine war, we've seen that in Ukraine and the countries surrounding Ukraine, that, again, these were the first responders getting resources out of the door. I think another interesting thread, which has always been in the back of my mind as the fund kind of, got going with its grant making, has been this sticky issue around social justice and human rights. And, I think community philanthropy, there are a couple of perceptions which don't really do it any favours. One is the idea that by asking communities to give, you're letting others off the hook. And, particularly governments, because communities have organised their resources because governments have failed often. But to me, this is around communities organising their resources so they can organise themselves, negotiate power, claim power, be seen as co-investors. But I think this other sort of narrative around community philanthropy, that who is the community, that it might be that it's the majority, that those at the edges are not considered to be part of the community. And that particularly if you're trying to mobilise resources at a local level, the instinct that you might end up, those activities might tilt towards things that were more status quo, that everybody accepted. And so over the years, this has been an area that we've given great attention to. So where we work with community foundations that are a bit more established, quite place-based, are mobilising local money, our question to them is, how are you reaching those at the edges, and are you? And I think our sort of hypothesis is if you have an organization that is in a community, and that community could be a place, an identity or an issue, but most of those with whom it is connected see it as doing a good job. I give, occasionally I receive because I'm part of this initiative group or whatever. Then these are the organizations who are well placed to start moving into issues that might be considered more contentious. So we saw that with the migrant crisis, some years back in Europe, that the groups that were saying we are working for migrant rights were often vilified because it was like, why are you worrying about migrants when we've got people with their own issues in the community? Yeah. But we, through our grants to some of our partners, we really encouraged them, and they responded, or they came to us and said, we would really like to do something, but we don't think we can do it with local money yet. To start moving at the edges to say, actually, let's bring migrants who come to the community into our spaces, and let's use the social capital and trust we have to start actually, to stop othering people, but to say these are people like we are. So I think there's something really interesting about, there's always a risk of just, sort of gathering around the sort of norms and not challenging yourself to really look to see if everyone is being included. So there's been really very interesting experiences around that. But I think also in the last few years, we've been deliberately looking at resource mobilization for human rights and social justice. And whether that's kind of within civil society groups and networks and movements, so the sort of self-resourcing idea. And I think there was some really powerful work that happened amongst LGBTQI communities, Roma communities and others during COVID, where they had no one else to go to, so they were forced to turn to themselves. And by doing so, that was a source of solidarity and support. So there was at a time of great pressure on a community, there was community strengthening that happened. But also, the really interesting strategies that are happening in countries where the state is really all out and hostile towards LGBTQI groups right now, really starting to see how can community philanthropy be a way for those groups that want to sort of reposition themselves and build more of a support base and a constituency by starting different kinds of conversations and actually starting to reach out to the community to say, we are the community, you are the community, we are together. And I think that's become increasingly important. I mean, if you look at Uganda this week, in a sense, I think this is where the funding of human rights work and the emergence of community philanthropy start to kind of collide. Has it been a terrible mistake for international funders, A, to fund human rights groups and not help them build their own resource bases, and B, this blueprint that we've got around what an NGO should look like? You should have a vision, mission, you should have your strategy, you should have your values, and you should tell the world what it is all the time. Does that actually not put a lot of people in danger? And we are complex beings, we live across multiple issues. You can be gay, but you could also have children and care about the environment. And so I think there's a sort of existential moment here around actually this whole idea that communities weren't to be trusted to fund human rights. We've created a beast of our own, our own making, if you like.
Yeah, talking about a beast, I don't know if I'm right if I'm to ascribe this movement to you, the Global Fund for Community Foundations, the Shifting the Power movement. And if I'm right, I think this goes back to as early as 2016 or 15 thereabout, when you had your first summit here. I mean, that movement, or the debate around that movement, has given rise to so many, I would say, different perspectives, but also maybe debates. So some people would call it decolonizing, philanthropy. Others will talk about localization or proximation. Some will talk about trust-based philanthropy, and you opted for shifting the power. How has the journey been since then to today?
So I suppose the first thing to say was we really were trying to promote an event at the time. We didn't really have a big budget for the event, and we thought, let's have a hashtag that really names what this is going to be about. We want to talk about, community philanthropy is the space in which we operate, and we see community philanthropy as a way to challenge North-South power, because actually suddenly you're talking about co-investment and resourcing. but also, as importantly, that so many of our partners themselves were concerned about power, because we were all aware of the dangers that it's not just about moving the locus of the money from London to Nairobi, if the power structures are still the same. And so I think there was something about also not dismissing community philanthropy as just being local fundraising, just being intermediary grant making, just all of these things which in the dominant system seem somehow instrumental rather than transformational. So we really wanted to shift the power as a way both which sort of related to our sense of the emergence of community philanthropy and its potential and its importance, but also to extend a hand to others, because community philanthropy is one pathway for shifting power. And so the idea was really to sort of, could we use a hashtag that would bring others in? So often in our sector that you don't go to something because you're not it. I won't go to that because I'm not a climate organisation. Oh, that's a women's that's not my club. And so we were trying to kind of create an environment where people who are interested in thinking differently might come and have high levels of participation from the Global South. So we were kind of slightly bowled away by the fact that it sort of took off in such a way. And of course 2016 was the year that the Grand Bargain was signed as well, which was the first kind of big localization commitment. But we weren't really aware of that time. I mean, I really wasn't working in an international development space in my mind at that time. And I think, I'd say a couple of things. To me, the importance of Shift the Power is it's just a signpost to a conversation about power, and it gets interpreted in many ways. So when governments in different countries don't like Shift the Power, they're obviously thinking about their own power and that they might need to shift it, right? But it really is it's a catalyst for a conversation. I think when I think about who has been involved in this, to me it is around the demand side of systems change. We know in recent years there was the localization commitments, COVID, the death of George Floyd, all of the kind of ripple effects of change that have gone through the system. I would say they were important and they needed to happen, and that's good. But I think a lot of these conversations still feel quite supply-side driven. And actually, if we're talking about the system we want, we have to think about it at every level. So I've just come from Malawi, where we spent 2 days talking about, well, what is it that civil society in Malawi needs to do differently and perhaps give up or say no to or rethink. And so that idea that this is something that is there to challenge us all, I think is critically important. The other thing I would say, which I think is a slight cause for caution, is, we've still used hashtag Shift the Power really to try and point to emergent practice and to say, actually, this is the emergence from civil society actors, movement actors, thinking about how do we get better at joining forces, acting as a collective, busting across silos, because the normal dynamics of the aid system and the development system and the philanthropy system is it's a lion and a lamb, and we're all negotiating individually, and you're never going to be winning. You're never going to tell a funder that their jokes weren't funny, So how to actually start growing that confidence to say, this is what we are, and this is what we want, and this is what we intend to do. But I would say, on the narrative stuff and the language issue, talking about decolonizing aid, talking about being anti-racist, talking about shifting power is not a proxy for doing it. And I think we have to be very aware. If you look at what happened during COVID, where the amount of money going to local civil society organizations in the Global South went down, the numbers speak for themselves. So you can have the best policies in the world, but actually the proof is in the pudding. And power concedes nothing without a struggle, right? To paraphrase Frederick Douglass. And so we there's something about being, not assuming we're all talking about the same things. Moses Isoba from the NGO Forum in Uganda yesterday said, the donors and NGOs involved in decolonization is like somebody steals your goat, and then the person that stole your goat comes and looks harder for the goat than anyone else, and then gives you resources to look for the goat. So I think we really need to be smart about language, and when shift the power, shifting power, locally led development. When there are academic exercises saying we want to look at case studies of shift the power to see if they worked, and you're saying, how can you ask this question around emergent systems that you never invested in? They haven't had time to breathe. They exist despite funding, not because of them. So I think there really needs to be we need to be politically more savvy around how we manage this and name things.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm glad you're raising those issues, because my sense is that there have been so many, at times even parallel processes and conversations, whether you're thinking of reimagining INGOs, the Ringo track, or you're thinking of the decolonizing philanthropy track and many others. Do you get a sense that, and I'm not assuming or even suggesting that they ought to collaborate or speak to each other, but you get a sense that there's a concerted effort to really deal genuinely with issues of shifting the power, if we use that language. I have my own interpretation of everything. I've always said I do hear what we're all calling for, but perhaps what we need to do is to connect different processes. Some of the processes could be talking about maybe sharing power. Others could be talking about redistributing power. Yeah. And then some could be talking about shifting the power. But there are certain things in between here that we will need to address. So, for example, what happens to those where power is taken away from? Do those that need to receive the full power, are they in a position to actually manage that power immediately? So there are so many of these conversations that are taking place, but you get a sense that there are synergies.
So I think I've sort of come to learn about systems change through what I've seen and where I see drivers and opportunities. I think we are in a system where the forces are strong for it not to change, and I think we need to acknowledge that. I think sometimes those that are the loudest are the ones that are actually perhaps not actually doing the thing, and sometimes the most transformative work is just not heard. I think there are good people across the system in different positions in the system, and those are the connections I think need to be made, is who are our allies? When can we go in through the front door? When do we need to send people in through the windows? And to start really, I think from a systemic perspective, I see a lot of resources going into these conversations in the supply side of the system, the dominant system. I see very few going into the demand side of it. People, particularly after COVID, where everyone came out exhausted, people are exhausted, they're overworked. I think we have to be really thoughtful about how do we create opportunities for people who are thinking about and practicing this work, to give them spaces to build this new thing. How do we resource the gaps between organizations? How do we create spaces? And so you're not demanding people to do things at the end of their day job. And I think there is an inequality of resources and time and spaces in the system at the moment. I do think we would be foolish if we were unable to kind of do this thing because we were quibbling around language. Yeah. And as I said, in the scheme of things, like we thought of the hashtag Shift the Power literally on a phone call one afternoon saying, well, let's use that. Yeah. And that, so it's not meant to contain everything. It's more like blowing the flame. Yeah. And there are, as you say, I think it's really important that we start understanding there are different pathways about it. It's not a kind of zero-sum game. It's a process of negotiation. I really like the Berkana two-loop model, which sort of talks about dominant systems like, the Roman Empire, fossil fuels, all systems come to an end, and they need to be hospiced and composted and all of that, and then new systems emerge. And I think we're in that moment now to acknowledge that where there'll be losses, some part of the system is going to have to help those losses to happen. So if international NGOs get considerably smaller, for example, there will be loss. There will be losses of different kinds, including personal loss. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, because there have been losses amongst those who never were able to do the thing they wanted to do for the lack of resources. So I do think having frameworks where is there a compelling idea? And then can we see how these different initiatives, they have different levers, they have different strengths, they have different positions. And can we actually work out what's the minimum but sufficient that binds us all, but appreciate that diversity matters. We won't change things unless we have these things. But what's the just enough connection so that, like electricity, you can start having electricity going through the wires? I mean, I think it's really an issue of how do we operationalize new power in that sense and avoid trying to have the solution. It's my solution, it's your solution. And so I think the way that I've been thinking about it, as long as we keep just saying power, shift it, then that will take many forms. And some of those we don't need to be involved with, and some of others do. But as long as we look to each other and nod, and at times pass to each other and pass back and show up together. And I think what we could really do much better in all of these initiatives is more showing up together, not saying, well, I don't like that particular word you use, but to say, do we have enough here to create larger alliances? Because I think I think it is generally a weakness of the left generally to kind of quibble around language rather than just go for it. Yeah.
So talking about losses, I mean, and maybe linking this back to our initial conversation around where the concept of community foundation came from and the dominance of maybe one narrative. There've been several losses in the movement in terms of personnel and other people. I mean, already I was sitting here thinking this conversation takes me back to some of the times I spent with Inviolata, for example. Who are some of the unsung people, or I don't know whether I should use heroes and heroines in the movement? Because you've been in this journey yourself for quite some time.
I have, and I would say, hand on heart, I wouldn't be with here without those trailblazers, those champions. You know, Rita Tapa, the founder of TEWA, Monica Matuku, one of the brains behind, I mean, the big brain behind the Kenya Community Development Foundation, Olga Alexeyeva, who really understood very early on in Russia that philanthropy needed to be democratic from the start. And I think part of the narrative that I think is really important to tell, and the conversations I've just come from in Malawi, is to say, actually, we are all making up. These are tributaries leading into a river, but let's not forget to look back and say who were the first crazy dancers who stood up on their own and everyone went, you're crazy. But as time went on, I mean, I think when the Kenya Community Development Foundation was set up 6 years ago, when TEWA was set up 32 years ago, those were the times when talking about, there was so much money in Kenya, in Nepal. Why on earth would you say no, not on those terms? We will build our own thing. And I think that level of bravery and the willingness to give up other things. The founders of both those organizations had well-paid jobs in the established part of the system. And I think we really do need to make sure that is part of the story. It's not what happens now. It's not what gets cooked up today and has a name. That's an essential part of this story, because I'm always struck by, I hadn't really sort of realized myself how, until probably about 7 or 8 years ago, how the way that we'd managed the work at the fund really mirrored the way many of our partners work at the local level. That's what I had picked up, which is you just need to be there, have some resources, create relationships, create connections. The work happens outside of you, and you don't have to worry about growing yourself bigger and bigger. It's actually, the role is to catalyze, is to be a resource, is to be an ally, is to journey with. So my sort of development theory, if one was to call it that, I think very much comes from those leaders and from the organizations we work with every day and continue to still.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, I wanted us to talk about these phenomenal women leaders in this sector, because my colleagues, Tandy, Letu, and Tim, are running an initiative that is focusing on women in philanthropy. And of course, you know, the sector has grown over time, but we still don't have much documentation around those leaders. I mean, you talk about Monica Mutuku. All of us are in awe when we look at where the Kenya Community Foundation is now. of course, thanks to Monica, to Joyce, to Janet, and Grace now, all we have done such a phenomenal work. I know you have done a case study of the KCDF. We have done a case study ourselves as well. And today is probably one of the most thriving but almost complex foundation in an African setting. I was recently there to just understand how they are structured.
Right.
And I realized that I actually thought I knew how they are structured until I sat down with the team to understand that there's the foundation, there's the trust, and then there is now a company that manages all their affairs. And fascinating development that you wouldn't, I mean, unless you go and sit down there and listen to them, you would not even appreciate the work that has gone in there. So we have this initiative that is coming up, and we want to pay tribute to women like that, those that have long gone, but even those that are currently in action. Which brings me to Bongi Mkabela. I remember there was a time when she was on your board, and you used to talk a lot about how she was bringing everything together, at least from potentially the perspective of community development. Maybe we spend a few minutes just reflecting on the fund, the Global Fund for Community Foundations, as a vehicle, but also how you managed to build it till today.
Well, yeah, it was thanks to people like Bongi was on the board, Rita was on the board, I think from the beginning, I realized there was an opportunity, there was a one-off opportunity. We had 3 years of funding to get some money out there to demonstrate some kind of proof of concept, that there was emergence was happening. There were the visible bits of it, of things that were called community foundations, but there was so much more. And back in those early years, I mean, I lent heavily on people like Akwasi Aidu and I mean, the Monica, others, to sort of help think this through. I knew from the start, and in fact it was in the words of Bongi, who from our first board meeting, she said the last thing the world needs is another cold bureaucracy. And that was my feeling too. This wasn't an organization for which success meant having a big staff and having, you know, Africa, Asia, all your staff working like that. To me, it really was actually, we were cooking up a cauldron here. And what mattered was the connections. And so to deliberately say, let's think about how can we use grants to build relationships, but small grants so that it's easier to build relationships. And I think that's true. It's been an asset for us that we didn't have to make big grants. How do we use grants also to collect data so we can start to aggregate and push data back to the field and say, does this tell your story? And for me, you know, in the early years, there were some really tough years where we had very little resource. And so the kind of idea of what's the point of doing this when we didn't have money? And there were a couple of years where we sort of sat down and said, in the absence of money for grant making, is there still something we could do? And that was really about building the relationships and the connections and creating other ways, doing the research, getting reports out there, that kind of thing was really, really important to say, there's something here. And there's something powerful about how we can accelerate some of this work by making sure that everyone doesn't have to start from zero again. If you can meet somebody who's just a bit further on down the line, or they did it that way and so you go back and change it that way, the idea of creative adaptation, if there can be a vehicle that can allow that knowledge and those relationships and connections to flow and do it globally, because I think there's something also about, you know, it's important to have country level infrastructure for philanthropy and civil society and regional, that's really important. But sometimes that can also be a bit claustrophobic. Sometimes the answer you're looking for lies with somebody from a part of the world you know nothing about and you've never been to, and yet that wisdom from somebody who knows nothing about your context lands in a way that is particularly special. So that's always been the sort of idea that there was some magic that happened here. I know for a number of years, once the organisation registered, and the board would kind of say, you know, this doesn't feel very, you know, what if you get run over by a bus? It's a very small team, you know, this kind of thing. And I kept on saying, if we want if I have to be fundraising for staff salaries, we won't be as bold. If there's that, but also like we're actually doing the work through the grants we're making, through the partnerships we're building. It's not about us doing the work. We sort of get to conduct the jazz here, to know when the drums are going to do their solo in Asia or what's going to happen in Uruguay, whatever. So that idea, and that's become a very big and interesting question for me in the last few years, is how can a global organisation that is a grant maker, so we do have some power, be in service of a movement? What's the right, how do we do what we do best, not overclaim, but create spaces in which other things happen? So a couple of years ago, we launched a standalone Shift the Power portal, really as a way to try and push it further out into the commons, to invite more voices and spaces of people who might want to contribute to the larger Shift the Power idea, that might not feel that community philanthropy website is somewhere where they might want it to be. So I think we've been playing with this. What are the sort of catalysts and the drivers in this kind of systems change process? And essentially, how can we do this without getting too big? How can we do this without becoming too much of a gatekeeper? How can we create other kinds of spaces? These have been the questions that have preoccupied me.
So we're about to land, but I have two things that I want to cover. So the first one is maybe in full disclosure, in 2016, talking about Olga, I received the Olga Prize, the fourth Olga Prize. Maybe, for me that has been really exciting, because at that point I didn't even know who Olga was. And then I started to read about this person and this creativity, the innovation that was involved. Maybe for people that might not know the importance of Olga and why you decided to have an award in her name, would you say a few words about that?
Yeah. So Olga Alexeeva she and I were co-directors of Charities Aid Foundation Russia in the late 90s. We used to share an office, and talk about an inspiration. I guess she was my original inspiration. She was a journalist, and she was basically a human rights activist, essentially. But she came into the field of philanthropy and saw that there was a short window where there was going to be international development aid, and a lot of that international development aid would not stick. It was going to come in, and there was a lot of effort to build civil society and then leave. And she knew that projects that didn't have roots wouldn't last. She was deeply concerned that although there'd been big political changes, the fall of the Soviet Union, the opening up of the free market, sort of somewhat democratic structures, she feared that essentially what has happened in Russia would happen, that actually there would be a pushback. So she understood community foundations as an essential space for Russians to even start to think about the notion of community. Before the end of the Soviet Union, there was no community, there was just the state and the citizens. And so she really understood how important it was to create structures that would enable people, government, private sector, civil society, community leaders to come together and to talk about the place in which they lived and to think about the resources and how they might be used. She was an absolute radical visionary. She had very, very bold ambitions. She wasn't scared to walk into the office of a Russian oligarch, stick her finger out, stab him in the chest and say, "You're doing it wrong." And the world needs more of those people who just had a vision that challenged everyone and made everyone feel slightly uncomfortable.
So when you guys gave me that prize then, I didn't think that I deserved it. I even told Caroline. But today when I look back, I see what the vision was about. So finally,
there you go.
So finally, the road to Colombia?
Yes.
The road to Colombia begins. What would be the issues that will seize the day? And what are the preparations? What are we expected to do so that when we get to Colombia, we are shaking the space?
Shaking the space, indeed. Well, one, we need to shake the space. So this will be the second Shift the Power Summit. This is when having a small team does become more an issue because we've actually got to get going on this. But I think the idea is really to move into a stage to say, this work is hard, but actually the gains that have been made since 2016, when the last summit was held, and all the stuff that's happened before, these seeds that were planted, they've not just germinated, they're starting to flourish and bloom, and things have happened, good things have happened. The world is in a very difficult and challenging place right now, and there's so much to look around at and just despair and almost throw up your hands and give up. But actually we know that the answers lie in communities organising themselves, grassroots groups, networks of people who just don't give up. They don't just scratch their head, read the paper and say, I can't do it anymore. This work is happening with or without us. And so I think the idea of like, how can we really show up in Bogota, a conversation to say, change is here. The demand side of change, the bubbling up of ideas, of innovations, we convince ourselves sometimes that we have to wait for others to give permission for things to exist. And I think this is really about moving ahead to say, these are, think how far we have come, and to start really galvanizing and creating. What I really want is to create that space that we had in Johannesburg, where it didn't really matter who you were or where you came from. There was just a buzz that everyone felt. Because I think too often we end up in our heads in this work, and really it's around our hearts. You know it when you see it, and you know it's the right thing to do. So that's what we're hoping for. So we're going to start rolling out different kinds of invitations for people to participate in consultations, and there'll be some small grants. We'll try to get some, a poster exhibit there. But the idea to sort of bring things together in Bogota to say, you can't ignore this. It is here. Let's move on from here.
Yeah. So all the best. We wish you the best in preparations, but also in making sure that the whole summit is going to be a success. I think the timing is very right, given all the debates that we were talking about, and a lot of wokeness that I think the Shift the Power movement has created. So all the best. Jenny, it's always nice catching up with you. I'm glad we have managed to sit down and record this, because at times we do have these conversations, but it's over coffee or something. But at this time we have recorded it. So thank you so much, Jenny, for gracing us with your presence.
Thank you, and I'll see you in Bogota before then, I'm sure, too.
That was Jenny Hodgson, the director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Thank you for watching. See you in another episode.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.